Yo, what's up, guys? And today we are going to see those pictures of the Franklin Township staff. Here we go. First, Acton Elementary, home of the Tigers. Alright, let's go up here to staff. Right, okay. Okay, first up, we have Miss Whistlebird, Miss Adams, Mr. Adams, Mrs. Angler, Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Beechler, Mrs. Robin, Mrs. Brooks, Mrs. Calvert, Mrs. Grinchenden, Miss Davis, kind of like I saw her at Gately before, Mrs. Elliott, Mrs. Emerine, Mr. Froning, Mrs. Gilkerson, Mrs. Green, but different than Miss Whistle, Mrs. Hag, Mrs. Hageman, Mrs. Jewell, Mrs. Kelly, Mrs. Kerr, Mrs. Krug, Mrs. Leal, Mrs. Mann, Mrs. Matters, Mrs. McConnell, Mrs. McMaster, Mrs. Milholland, Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Mobley, Mrs. Mrs. Money, Mrs. Knifert, Mr. Nicewonder, Mrs. Parsons, Mrs. Walkley, Mrs. Poole, Mrs. Ramey, Mrs. Reynolds, Mrs. Rigsby, Mrs. Ryan, Mrs. Scott, Mrs. Simmons, Mrs. Smith and Smith, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Stevens, Mrs. Stevenson, and Mrs. Sutton. Let's go to the next school. Next up, Adams Elementary. Steph. First up, Mrs. Gregg, Mrs. Adams, Mrs. Back, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Betts, Mrs. Ballina, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Campbell, Mrs. Coons, Mrs. Craig, Mrs. Davis, Mrs. Decker, Mrs. Mrs. Dewey, Mrs. Douglas, Mrs. Furrickson, Mrs. Frost, Mrs. Grayson, Mrs. Skilland, Mrs. Groves, Mrs. Graves, Mrs. Gray, Mrs. Grainsides, Mrs. Hannah, Mrs. Hanson, Mrs. Hardcastle, Mrs. Devon, Mrs. Hayden, Mrs. Higginbottom, Mrs. Hoots, Mrs. Howard, Mrs. Hughes, Mrs. Jeffries, Mrs. Johnson, Miss Lambert, Miss Lambert, Mrs. Lambert, Mrs. Leatherwood, Miss Martin, another Miss Martin, Miss McRae, Mrs. McCurdy, Mrs. McQueen, kind of like from Cars, Mrs. McShimmick, Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Millen, Mrs. Murphy, kind of like the principal at Dallas Crossing, Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Michelson, Mrs. Auden, Mrs. Orms, Mrs. Pittman, Mrs. Purrior, Mrs. Puckett, Mrs. Purvitz, Mrs. Reiterin, Mrs. Rhodes, Mrs. Roberts, Mrs. Russell, Mrs. Scheller, Mrs. Shuck, Mrs. Trimbury, Mrs. Wilburn, and Mrs. Yoeman. Next school. Alright. To the next one. Alright. Mrs. Morris, Mrs. Agee, Mrs. Ashbrook, Mrs. Urty, Mrs. Beer. That's the birthday dinner because it's my brother's name. Mrs. Blas, Mrs. Boyce, Mrs. Bruce, Mrs. Beth. That's Mrs. Custody Bird. Mrs. Church, Mrs. Cotto, Mrs. Crosby, Mrs. Dodd, Mrs. Yates, Mrs. Eaton, Mrs. Eck, Mrs. Esther, Mrs. Fleenor, Mrs. Fundersel, Mrs. Geddes, Mrs. Glangster, Mrs. Garrison, Mrs. Gossard, Mrs. Glyfield, Hoy, Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Harper, Mrs. James, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Kuiper, Mrs. Glee, Mrs. Leonardo, Mrs. Lightholder, Mrs. Mullins, Mrs. Murrin, Mrs. Osha, Mrs. Piegu, Mr. Peters, Mrs. Porter, Mr. Proctor, Mrs. Rubiner, Mrs. Reynolds, kind of like from Acton, Mrs. Rice, Mrs. Ross, that's kind of like a first name as Miss Baldwin, Mrs. Rush, Mrs. Russell, Mrs. Shanez, Mrs. Sanders, Mrs. Shanek, Mrs. Sears, Mrs. Sear, Mrs. Spokey, Mrs. Selmer, Mrs. Spencer, Mrs. Swick, Mrs. Ted Rowe, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Tohens, Mrs. Joni, Mrs. Warner, Mrs. Terep, Mrs. Winnisbash, Mrs. Wood, Mrs. Clara, Mrs. Woodward, Mr. Russell, and Mrs. New York. Kind of like New York. Let's go move to Bunker Hill. Alright. Good. Stuff. Mrs. Finn, Mrs. Andrew, Mrs. Becker, Mrs. Benson. Kind of like from, I saw her acting. Okay. Mrs. Bingham, Mrs. Boyle, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Cannon, Mrs. Carsell, Mrs. Christie, Mrs. Cooper, another Mrs. Cooper, Mr. Cooper, Mrs. Kraft, Mrs. Day, Mrs. Danlip, Mrs. England, kind of like the country of England. That's where Scott lives. Mrs. Everest, Mrs. Ferguson, Mrs. Fields, Mrs. Curtis, Mrs. Hall, another Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Hamblett, Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Just, Mrs. Kale, Mrs. Anna, Mrs. Tracy, Miss Lewis, Mr. Jeremiah, but they were not Mr. Marshall. But he didn't get a picture. Because I saw him before acting. And I saw him and Tosman crossing again. And he used to have him again. Alright, next. Mrs. Martin, Mrs. Maternity, Mrs. McCain, Mrs. McDonald, Mrs. McDonald, kind of like McDonald's a fast food restaurant, Mrs. McMillan, Mrs. McWorchard, Mrs. Merck, Mrs. Milligan, Mrs. Muckway, Mrs. Nance, Mrs. Oliver, Mrs. Pierce, Miss Peters, Mrs. Pickett, Mrs. Ray, Mrs. Ransett, Mrs. Ross, Mrs. Sanato, Mrs. Sanator, Mrs. Schiller, Mrs. Seaver Droids, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Another Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Stetton, Mrs. Drow, Mrs. Webster, Mrs. Wethington, Mrs. White, Mrs. West, and Mrs. Zitterman. Alright, let's go to the next school. Next is Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Lumber, Mrs. Amy, Mrs. Anderson, Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Edrick, Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Burris, Mrs. Bayless, Mrs. Beaton, Mrs. Banks, Mrs. Buckler, Mrs. Bunglet, Mrs. Brewer, Mrs. Bofey, Mr. Brown, Mr. Brown, Mrs. Burrett, Mrs. Chase, Mrs. Cotterman, Mrs. Cairborn, Mrs. Clayton, Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Crawford, Mrs. Criswell, Mrs. Curtis, Mrs. Dalstorm, Mrs. Damon, Mr. Delk, Mrs. Devor, Mrs. DeWitt, Mr. Doran, Mrs. Depler, Mrs. Eckerty, Mrs. Elliott, Mrs. Earp, Mrs. Everingham, Mrs. Flannery, Mrs. Fornter, Mrs. Flower, Mrs. French, kind of like the language of France, Mrs. Fiona, Mrs. Garman, Mrs. George, Mrs. Jack, Mrs. Gilbert, Mrs. Gaya, Mrs. Gilman, Mrs. Green, Mrs. without an E, Mrs. Gregg, Mrs. Hager, Mrs. Schwank, Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Hector, Mrs. Hendricks, Mrs. Hershey, Mrs. Hickle, Mrs. Shirley, Mrs. Hudson, Mrs. Howland, Mr. Howland, Mrs. Hubbard, Mrs. Arisa, Mrs. Isaacs, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Keller, Mrs. Kemp, Mrs. Kempener, Mrs. Kinder, Mrs. Capel, Mrs. Lemoners, Mrs. Lawson, Mrs. Lessing, Mrs. Lifford, Mrs. Ledden, Mrs. Luke, Mrs. Manning, Mrs. McCluskey, Mrs. McConnell, Mrs. McDaniel, Mrs. Milster, Mrs. Moffat, Mrs. Morgan, Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Nagel, Mrs. Nevery, Mrs. Ottle, Mrs. Allums, Mrs. Nicole, Mrs. Alvarez, Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Pember, Washington, Miss Peters, Miss Puckett, Miss Rayborn, Miss Richards, Miss Robinson, Miss Burgess, Mrs. Resson, Mrs. Sugar, Mrs. Shirley, Mrs. Shriner, Mrs. Slider, Mrs. Smith, another Mrs. Smith, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Shredrin, Spillman, Spymore, Settler, Stevens, Mrs. Stevens, Mrs. Styron, Mrs. Slice, Mr. Taylor, another Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Turkin, Mrs. Vanessa, Mrs. Van Vliet, Mrs. Vento, Mr. Walker, Mrs. Walker, Mr. Wolf, Mrs. Weck, Mrs. Welch, Mrs. Winton, Mrs. Wise, and Mrs. Wateridge. And they don't have Miss Aponte in it. All the way to the top. Next, we have 2 more elementary schools left. Next, South Creek. Home of the Gators. Mrs. Myers, Mrs. Engler, Mr. Allen, Mrs. Arnold, Mr. Baker, Mrs. Barnhart, Mrs. Brinberg, Mrs. Bryant, Mrs. Burns, Mrs. Cade, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Sherwin, Mrs. Connor, Mrs. Costello, Mrs. Daines, Mrs. Day, Mrs. Dicker, Mrs. Dick, Mrs. Evans, Mrs. Green, Mrs. Hancock, Mrs. Hartley, Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Haynes, Mrs. Hedden, Mrs. Hensley, Mrs. Comstock, Mrs. Hubbard, Mrs. Hughes, Mrs. Jarrett, Mrs. Jetter, Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Kane, Mrs. Kellum, Mrs. Long, Mrs. Lowe, that's silly, Mrs. Lundberg, Mrs. Maps, Mrs. McGowan, Mrs. Mitcher, Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Mitchell, Mrs. Monday, like a day of the week, Mrs. Moody, Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Parks, Mrs. Pierce, but I saw her at Thompson Crossing, but when she works at South Creek, she moved into a different school, Thompson Crossing. Mrs. Price, Mrs. Randall, Mrs. Robinson, Mrs. Rollins, Mrs. Rowland, Mrs. Russell, Mrs. Shrella, Mrs. Stranger. These strangers, people you don't know. Here's Miss Stinson, Mrs. Sweetman, Mrs. Tinkle, Mrs. Tinsley, Mrs. Toep, Mrs. Treeb, Mrs. Vento, Mrs. Wisery, Mr. Matthew, Mrs. Watts, Mrs. Webb, Mrs. Williams, and Mrs. Wise. And Jetter. And did you know about and last up, Thompson Crossing. Alright, but this is going to be a bunch of teachers. Alright, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Ames, Mrs. Arnett, Mrs. Baldwin, Mrs. Barker, Mrs. Baisley, Mrs. Blue, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Bunch, Mr. Bunch, Mrs. Collingford, Mrs. Denton, Mrs. Jonley, Mrs. Erdman, Mr. Fellerman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Foreman, Mr. Forey, Mrs. Freeman, Miss Gaborsby, Mrs. Hacker, Mrs. Harris, Mrs. Harves. She works with Mrs. Pierce at Thompson Crossing. But Miss Pierce used to be one from South Creek. Mrs. Hank, Mrs. Helen, Mrs. Huff, Mrs. Cass, Mrs. Lehoga, Mrs. Marshall, Mrs. May, Mrs. Brad, Mrs. McKinney, Mrs. McQuitty, Mr. Moore, Mrs. Moore, Mrs. Nadler, Mrs. Nine, Mrs. O'Friel, Mrs. Pierce. We already saw that picture from the South Creek picture. Mrs. Rath, Mrs. Roberts, Mrs. Salvo, Mrs. Chanel, Mr. Schnipp. Wait. Mrs. Sharon, Mr. Simmons, Mrs. Sizemore, Mrs. Smiley, Mrs. Snow, Mrs. Stackhouse. That's silly. Mrs. Stickles, Mrs. Thurston, Mrs. Vick, Mrs. Watts, Mrs. Whitfield, Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Young, and Mrs. Zellman. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.